On September 30th, 2025, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 houses fell into the Atlantic Ocean in 45 minutes. They were on Cottage Avenue and Tower Circle Road in Buxton, North Carolina, on Hatteras Island, which is part of the Outer Banks. Nobody was inside, nobody was injured. The houses were vacation rentals built on wooden pilings above the sand, and for a while the pilings held, and then the sand beneath them didn't, and then the Atlantic came in, and the houses went sideways into the surf and broke apart, sending lumber and insulation and shingles across miles of national seashore beach. 5 days later, another house followed. 4 weeks after that, 5 more. And then a nor'easter in February 2026 took 4 more. By the time the count reached 31 collapsed houses since 2020, the National Park Service had stopped sounding surprised. The superintendent of Cape Hatteras National Seashore, Dave Halleck, told reporters there would probably be more. He was right. There were. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Dare County, which covers most of the Outer Banks, generated $2.1 billion in visitor spending in 2024. Tourism accounts for nearly half of every job in the county. The average Dare County resident saves $3,860 a year in taxes because tourists pay so much of the freight. The entire economy of this place, every restaurant, every surf shop, every real estate office, every bridge toll, rests on the beach. And the beach is leaving. This is not a story about climate change exactly, although climate change accelerates it. It is not a story about bad government or greedy developers, although both play their parts. It is a story about building on sand. It is about what happens when human ambition meets a landscape that was never meant to be permanent and refuses to accept the answer. The Outer Banks has been giving that answer for a very long time. The first people to ignore it arrived in July of 1587. 117 English men, women, and children came ashore on Roanoke Island that summer, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I to establish the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Their governor was a painter named John White. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was born on August 18, 1587, the first English child born in the Americas. White sailed back to England for supplies. War with Spain delayed his return for 3 years. When he finally made it back in 1590, the settlement was deserted. The houses were dismantled. The colonists were gone. The only clue was a single word carved into a post: Croatoan. No one has ever determined what happened to those 117 people. They remain, after more than 4 centuries, the lost colony. Vanished from a barrier island. Swallowed by something, the wilderness, the sea, the continent itself. The mystery has never been solved, and the Outer Banks has never stopped swallowing things. Start with the ocean floor. Somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 ships lie wrecked off the coast of the Outer Banks, depending on whose estimate you trust. David Stick, the great Outer Banks historian, coined the name in his 1952 book, The Graveyard of the Atlantic. The geography is diabolical. The Gulf Stream, flowing north from the tropics, collides with the Labrador Current, flowing south from the Arctic, right at the elbow of Cape Hatteras. Where those 2 rivers of water meet, the ocean churns. Sandbars called diamond shoals extend 8 to 10 miles out from the cape, constantly shifting, sometimes 3 feet deep where a captain expected 30. Add fog, hurricanes, nor'easters, and a low-lying coastline nearly invisible from the water at night, and you have a stretch of ocean that has been killing ships since a Spanish brigantine went down off Cape Fear in 1526, the first recorded wreck. The latest was in 2012. Nearly 5 centuries of ships hitting sand where they expected open water. The people who lived on the Outer Banks for most of that history understood exactly what kind of place this was. They were called bankers, small communities of fishermen, pilots, and salvagers scattered along the island since the 1700s. They fished, they farmed a little, they tended livestock, which they could let roam free because islands don't need fences. And when ships wrecked on the shoals, they went out and salvaged whatever washed ashore: timber, rope, cargo, sometimes the ships themselves. There is a legend, probably a legend, possibly not, that bankers would tie a lantern to the neck of an old horse and walk it along the beach at night, mimicking the motion of a ship's light, luring vessels onto the shallow water near the breakers. A writer from Harper's New Monthly magazine recorded this story in the mid-19th century, and the name Nags Head may or may not come from that practice. Whether or not they actually lured ships to their doom, the bankers built their houses from shipwreck lumber. They lived, quite literally, on the bones of the graveyard. They didn't fight the ocean. They profited from its violence. The wrecks have specific names and specific tragedies. The Metropolis went down near Currituck in 1878, killing nearly 100 people, one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in American history. The USS Huron, a Navy gunboat, sank off Nags Head in 1877, its remains still sitting in 20 feet of water where divers visit it today. The Carroll A. Deering, a 5-masted schooner, ran aground on Diamond Shoals in 1921 under circumstances so bizarre, the crew gone, the lifeboats gone, a meal half prepared in the galley, that it became known as a ghost ship, and the mystery of its missing crew was never solved. Blackbeard himself prowled these waters. His ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was discovered off the Outer Banks in 1996, and archaeologists have since pulled up anchors, cannons, and bronze fittings. The wreckage that the government could see eventually demanded a response. By 1874, the U.S. Life-Saving Service had established stations every 7 miles along the coast, each one manned by surfmen who drilled endlessly in how to row through pounding surf, fire rescue lines to stricken ships, and haul half-drowned sailors through the breakers. Those stations and those men would eventually become the United States Coast Guard. In 1830, a Perquimans County planter named Francis Nixon sailed across the Roanoke Sound to the Outer Banks and purchased 200 acres near a massive sand dune called Jockey's Ridge. He was escaping the malaria and summer heat of his inland plantation. He brought his family. Friends followed. By 1838, the first hotel appeared at Nags Head, a wooden structure on the Sound side with room for 200 guests and an 800-foot railway that carried visitors by mule-drawn cart to the ocean beach. By the 1850s, more than 24 cottages dotted the landscape from Sound to sea. Wealthy families from the surrounding counties spent entire summers there, the wives and children arriving in June, the husbands visiting on weekends by steamboat. There was a ballroom. There was bowling. There were church services on the sand. Nags Head became, by most accounts, North Carolina's first resort town. It did not last, of course. Nothing on the Outer Banks lasts. The Civil War arrived in 1861, and after Union forces captured Roanoke Island in February 1862, Confederate General Henry Wise ordered the Nags Head Hotel burned rather than let it fall to the Yankees. The shifting sands of Jockey's Ridge eventually buried what remained. After the war, the summer families came back and rebuilt, but they rebuilt modestly. Cedar-shingled cottages with wraparound porches and propped shutters, built from whatever they could salvage, set back from the ocean on the Sound side, where the water was calmer. These houses, weathered silver gray by salt and wind, became known as the unpainted aristocracy. Some of them still stand in Nags Head today, a row of old cottages along the beachfront, looking almost defiant in their plainness against the massive rental palaces that have sprouted around them. The original families who built those cottages understood something that later developers would forget. On a barrier island, you build light. You build cheap. You expect to lose it. In 1870, the federal government completed a new lighthouse at Cape Hatteras, the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States, at 198 feet, painted in its distinctive black and white spiro. It was positioned 1,500 feet from the ocean, set on a floating foundation of yellow pine timbers resting on compacted sand. It was built to guide ships past diamond shoals, the same shoals that had been killing them for centuries. The light was visible for miles. The lighthouse was magnificent. And the ocean began moving toward it almost immediately. This is the part that matters, and it takes a moment to absorb. The Outer Banks is not a fixed piece of land with water on both sides. It is a ribbon of sand that has been migrating westward for at least 10,000 years. Storms crash over the ocean side, erode sand from the eastern face, and deposit it on the sound side to the west. The islands roll over themselves, slowly, like a wave in geological time. An inch here, a foot there, 12 feet a year in some stretches. The barrier islands are not a wall against the ocean. They are the ocean's way of negotiating with the land. They are, by their nature, temporary. By 1970, the Atlantic had closed to within 120 feet of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. A century of erosion had eaten through 1,380 feet of beach. Federal agencies tried everything: seawalls, sandbags, growing structures, pumped sand. Nothing held. The lighthouse that was built to outlast the centuries was now a year or two of bad storms from toppling into the surf. The question was no longer whether to save it, but how. That question would take almost 30 years to answer. The answer, when it came, would cost $12 million and involve sliding a 4,830-ton brick tower half a mile across the sand on steel rails. But that comes later. First, the Outer Banks had to become something worth saving. Two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, arrived in the fall of 1900, looking for the most desolate place they could find. Wilbur and Orville Wright had written to the United States Weather Bureau asking for a location with strong, steady winds, soft sand for crash landings, and as few people as possible watching. The Bureau recommended Kitty Hawk, a fishing village of about 300 people on the northern Outer Banks. The Wrights arrived and set up camp near a 100-foot sand dune called Kill Devil Hill, 4 miles south of the village. They came back every fall for 4 years. On December 17, 1903, on a cold morning with 27-mile-per-hour winds clocked at the government weather station nearby, Orville Wright climbed onto a biplane with a 40-foot wingspan, slid down a launching rail into the wind, and flew for 12 seconds, covering 120 feet. 12 seconds. They did it 3 more times that day, the longest flight lasting 59 seconds over 852 feet. Then a gust of wind caught the flyer on the ground and destroyed it, and the 1903 flying season was over. The Wright brothers chose the Outer Banks because it was empty, because nobody was there, because the wind and the sand and the isolation made it the perfect place to do something impossible without anyone interfering. That emptiness, that wind-blasted, sand-scoured, shipwreck-haunted remoteness was the Outer Banks' defining quality for most of its history. It was what drew the Wrights, and it was what made the bankers' way of life possible. It was also, inevitably, the thing that tourism would erase. The bridges came first. A causeway connected the mainland to Roanoke Island, and then the Wright Memorial Bridge opened in 1930, spanning the Currituck Sound and linking the mainland directly to the barrier islands near Kitty Hawk. For the first time, you could drive to the Outer Banks. In 1932, a 60-foot granite monument shaped like a bird's wing was dedicated on top of Kill Devil Hill. In 1937, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Paul Green premiered The Lost Colony, an outdoor drama staged on Roanoke Island at the Waterside Theater, on the actual site where those 117 colonists had vanished 350 years earlier. President Roosevelt attended the opening. The WPA had built the theater. WPA actors performed in the production. More than 4 million people have seen The Lost Colony since then. It is the longest-running outdoor drama in America, entering its 89th season. Then came World War II, and the ocean became a killing field again. In January 1942, German Admiral Karl Donitz launched Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat, sending U-boats to prowl the American coast. His commanders already knew what every mariner since the 16th century had learned. Cape Hatteras was a navigational choke point, a place where shipping lanes narrowed and vessels had to pass close to shore. The waters off the Outer Banks, already the graveyard of the Atlantic, became Torpedo Junction. By January, about 19 German submarines patrolled the Atlantic coastline, with 2 or 3 lurking at any given time in the shadow of Diamond Shoals. The U-boats picked off merchant ships, tankers, freighters, passenger vessels, with almost no American resistance. The Navy was unprepared, the coast undefended, and the German crews had been hardened by 2 years of war in the North Atlantic. At the height of the slaughter, they were sinking a ship almost every day. The first victim is believed to have been the Alan Jackson, a fully loaded oil tanker torpedoed about 60 miles off Cape Hatteras on January 18, 1942. In the first 6 months that followed, 86 merchant ships were sunk off the Outer Banks. At least 1,200 men died, the vast majority of them merchant mariners. Flaming tankers burned so brightly off Hatteras that on shore, residents said, you could read a newspaper by the glow at night. Oil, wreckage, and corpses washed up on the beaches of the same islands where tourists had been sunbathing the summer before. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall warned that the submarine losses now threaten our entire war effort. President Roosevelt kept the details quiet because he didn't want citizens to panic. But the Outer Banks residents who were alive during those months remembered them vividly for the rest of their lives. The first U-boat kill by the American Navy, the destroyer USS Roper sinking U-85 on April 14, 1942, off Nags Head, was a turning point. By June, convoy systems and air patrols had pushed most of the U-boats elsewhere. 4 German submarines never returned to Germany. But the toll had been staggering, and it had proved something the bankers and the life-saving men had always known. The ocean off these islands does not distinguish between friend and enemy. It takes what it takes. After the war, the Outer Banks slowly became something else. In 1953, Cape Hatteras National Seashore was established, the first national seashore in the United States, stretching 70 miles from Bodie Island to Ocracoke, preserving one of the longest undeveloped stretches of beach on the Atlantic coast. The idea was federal protection. Keep the wildest parts wild, while the towns grew around them. It worked, mostly, though it created the peculiar dynamic that defines the Outer Banks today. Private development butting right up against federal land, vacation mansions standing a few hundred yards from pristine national seashore. The same storms hitting both, but only one side getting rebuilt. And in March 1962, the Ash Wednesday storm, a savage nor'easter that stalled off the coast for 3 days, demonstrated what a truly determined ocean could do. The storm destroyed hundreds of structures, reshaped entire stretches of coastline, and cut new inlets through the islands. It was a preview. Nobody treated it that way. But first, it is worth noting what had happened in the 1930s, because without it, none of what followed would have been possible. In 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps arrived on the Outer Banks and began doing something counterintuitive, building sand dunes. The barrier islands had always been flat, overwashed, wind-scoured. The Wright brothers chose them precisely because they were bare. The CCC planted sea oats and American beach grass, erected sand fences, and constructed an artificial dune ridge along nearly the entire ocean front. The idea was to stabilize the islands, to stop the sand from moving. It worked, for a while. The dunes grew, vegetation took hold. The islands stopped looking like the barren sandscape the Wrights had known and started to resemble something buildable, something you could sell. The CCC's dune line became the foundation on which the entire development boom was built. It also, as geologists would later point out, interrupted the natural overwash process that had kept the islands healthy for millennia. The mom-and-pop motel era came next, small family-built operations along the beach road. The Carolinian opened in Nags Head in 1947, advertising the novel luxuries of baths and telephones in every room, and a dining room with ocean views. The Seafoam Motel went up in 1948, its name spelled out in seafoam-colored letters on the roof, knotty pine paneling in the rooms, an in-ground pool that felt exotic. Roy and Dot Westcott opened the Cavalier by the Sea in Kill Devil Hills in 1950. The family still owns it. Kill Devil Hills incorporated as a town in 1953. David Stick, the historian who had named the Graveyard of the Atlantic, became a major real estate developer, building the community of Southern Shores. The Herbert C. Bonner Bridge opened in 1963, spanning Oregon Inlet and connecting Bodie Island to Hatteras Island, making the southern Outer Banks accessible by car for the first time. It was a concrete and steel lifeline that functioned for more than 50 years until it was replaced in 2019 by the Mark Basnight Bridge, the old span demolished because the shifting shoals of Oregon Inlet had undermined its foundations. Even the bridges, it turned out, were temporary. Stick noted that bridge construction had expanded the developed areas of Outer Banks beaches from about a mile in the 1910s to 75 miles by 1970. Between 1985 and 1995, Dare County's year-round population grew 48%, more than 8,000 new residents. Commercial building permits increased more than five-fold, from 47 to 250, and the value of that construction jumped 276%. Summer visitation rose 54%, from an average of 102,000 people per day to nearly 157,000. Go-kart tracks and batting cages appeared in the dunes. National chain stores arrived for the first time. A Holiday Inn opened in Hatteras Village, a place that had been inhabited primarily by fishermen and native fishing families within living memory. The Outer Banks was no longer a place you escaped to. It was a place you invested in. The biggest boom was still ahead. By the turn of the millennium, low interest rates and rising consumer confidence collided with the growing reputation for the OBX as a drive-to family destination. Developers, especially in the northern beaches around Corolla in Currituck County, went on a building spree unlike anything the Barrier Islands had seen. In the 1960s, Corolla was close to uninhabited. Visitors could stand on the beach and see one or two houses in either direction. By the 2000s, it was wall-to-wall construction. And the houses were not the modest three-bedroom cottages of the previous generation. They were purpose-built rental machines with 8, 10, 12, sometimes 20 or more bedrooms, each with a private bath, designed to maximize occupancy and weekly rental income. Private pools, hot tubs, game rooms, elevator access, rooftop decks. You can rent a 24-bedroom oceanfront house on the Outer Banks today for a family reunion and pay 6 figures for a peak season week. These houses were not built for anyone to live in. They were built to generate revenue. They were, in the language of the rental industry, investment properties. And here is where the economics start to curdle. Dare County's permanent population is roughly 37,000. Its summer population balloons to well over 200,000 on peak days. Tourism produces $2.1 billion in annual spending. It generates $147 million in state and local tax revenue. It accounts for 12,260 jobs, 45.5% of all employment in the county. There is essentially no other industry, no manufacturing, no agriculture to speak of, no military base, no university, no hospital system large enough to anchor an alternative economy. When the weather closes Highway 12 and the tourists can't get through, the economy shuts down. Since 2015, Highway 12 has been partially or completely closed for 9,549 hours, the equivalent of 398 days. nearly a full year of economic standstill, accumulated in storm-sized increments. Highway 12 is, by almost any measure, the most vulnerable highway in North Carolina. It runs the length of the Outer Banks' southern islands: Pea Island, Rodanthe, Avon, Buxton, Frisco, Hatteras. A two-lane road pinched between the Atlantic on one side and the Pamlico Sound on the other. In places, the island is so narrow that a single storm surge can wash completely across it, flooding the highway under feet of ocean water and sand. North of Rodanthe, there was a stretch called the S-curves, twisting loops of road so exposed to the Atlantic that highway officials erected an artificial dune made of 2,200 sandbags, each bag 15 feet long, 2 feet tall, and 5 feet wide, and buried the dike in still more sand to try to hold the ocean back. It didn't work. Storm after storm crashed over the top, tore the sandbags apart, flooded the road, and shut down the only land route to communities that depend entirely on tourist traffic for survival. The North Carolina Department of Transportation spent $80 million in a single decade keeping Highway 12 open, and that doesn't include the 3 new bridges built to bypass stretches that simply couldn't be maintained any longer, which pushed the total cost toward $500 million. In 2022, a $145 million jug-handle bridge opened north of Rodanthe to bypass the worst of the S-curves. An extended bridge, one that could leapfrog the island's most eroded sections entirely, was considered. The estimated cost was over $1 billion. Local opposition and sticker shock killed the idea. Now consider the beach nourishment. This is the term for what amounts to an ongoing, open-ended construction project to rebuild the beaches themselves. Dredging ships suck sand from offshore deposits and pump it onto eroded shoreline. The sand widens the beach, rebuilds dunes, and protects structures and roadways from storm waves. It also washes away. Every project is designed to last 5 years. The last major project in Buxton, completed in 2022, didn't last 3. Dare County has spent more than $300 million on beach nourishment over the last decade. The cost per cubic yard of sand has risen from about $8 to over $13, a 60% increase. In 2026, 3 simultaneous nourishment projects are underway. $7.7 million for Avon, up to $50 million for Buxton, and $36.4 million for Nags Head. To fund this, the county borrowed $56.5 million and is leaning heavily on a $30 million FEMA grant. Without that federal money, the county manager described the funding model as a house of cards. That phrase, house of cards, hangs in the air when you look at the numbers. The occupancy tax on vacation rentals, the prepared meals tax, the property tax revenue from inflated coastal valuations, all of it flows from tourism. Tourism flows from the beach. The beach is manufactured. The manufacturing is getting more expensive every year, and the product, sand piled on a barrier island, has a shorter shelf life every cycle. We're dumping money into the ocean, one county official told state legislators in 2026, asking for help. On June 17, 1999, engineers from International Chimney Corporation of Buffalo, New York, began moving the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. They had spent months preparing, separating the tower from its granite and brick foundation on February 22nd, installing hydraulic jacks and steel beams, building a track of 1,500 steel rails across the sand. The lighthouse weighed 4,830 tons. It was 198 feet tall. At the time of the move, the Atlantic was 15 feet from its base. Many experts and a vocal group of local residents organized under the banner Save the Lighthouse, meaning save it where it stood, had argued that the move would collapse it. The old bricks would crack. The mortar would crumble. You simply could not slide a structure that massive across a barrier island without reducing it to rubble. Congress approved the funding in 1998. The debate had raged for 3 decades, ever since engineers first sounded the alarm in the late 1960s. A report by the National Academy of Sciences had studied 10 different options: seawalls, jetties, sand replenishment, abandonment, and concluded that relocation was the most cost-effective path. North Carolina State University independently reviewed the options in 1996 and agreed. It took 23 days. The tower traveled 2,900 feet to the southwest, inching along on hydraulic jacks at a pace measured in feet per hour, while spectators lined up to watch and television cameras broadcast the progress live. The tower arrived at a new site 1,500 feet from the shoreline, the same distance it had been when it was first built in 1870. The entire light station, 7 historic structures, cisterns, all of it, was reassembled in exactly the same spatial relationship as the original. The American Society of Civil Engineers awarded the project its Outstanding Civil Engineering Achievement for the year 2000. They called it the Move of the Millennium. The total cost was approximately $12 million. It was, by any accounting, a triumph. Today, the lighthouse draws more visitors than ever, and a $19.2 million renovation is underway to preserve it further. But here is what nobody said out loud, or at least not loudly enough. They had just moved America's most famous lighthouse to escape the same ocean that was advancing on everything else. The lighthouse was saved because it was irreplaceable. What about the things that aren't? The National Park Service website for the historic Cape Hatteras Lighthouse site, where the tower originally stood, ends with a quiet sentence that could be the epitaph for the entire Outer Banks. With this retreat from the sea, the Cape Hatteras Light Station sits safely behind you. For now. For now. That is the phrase that governs everything on the Outer Banks. A 2024 report by federal, state, and local officials found that 750 of nearly 8,800 oceanfront structures in North Carolina are at risk from oceanfront erosion. The majority of the houses falling into the sea are vacation rentals or second homes. The report acknowledged that the problem will inevitably worsen, considering sea level rise forecasts. It did not mention climate change. In Rodanthe, where several houses have collapsed, the annual erosion rate averages about 14 feet per year. Dare County has declined to fund nourishment there, citing the small number of properties relative to the enormous cost. The houses on Ocean Drive in Rodanthe, some of them featured in the movie Nights in Rodanthe, sit on pilings in the surf zone, waiting. The debris is its own crisis. Every house that falls sends lumber, insulation, nails, wiring, fiberglass, and shingles into the surf and across miles of federally protected beach. The Cape Hatteras National Seashore has had to organize cleanup events after each collapse. But the smaller pieces, the shards, the nails, the fragments of someone's rental kitchen, keep washing up for months. The Park Service warns that more are coming. In Buxton, where 20 houses have fallen since September 2025 alone, the entire beach in front of the village has been closed at times due to hazardous debris and the risk of further collapse. Stan Riggs, a geologist at East Carolina University who spent decades studying the Outer Banks coastline, put it flatly. These are not natural disasters, he said. These are human disasters. We knew 150 years ago how fast that shoreline is changing, and you do not want to put a house down there. But they did, and they keep doing it, because the economics demand it, because the tax revenue depends on it, because 12,260 jobs and $2.1 billion in annual spending and $147 million in taxes flow through a system built on the assumption that the beach will be there next summer, and the summer after that, and the one after that. Beach nourishment is not a solution. It is a subscription, and the subscription price keeps going up. Insurance is the canary. Flood insurance near Cape Hatteras runs $3,000 to $5,000 a year. Standard homeowners policies in coastal North Carolina increasingly exclude wind damage, the very thing most likely to destroy your house in a hurricane. Homeowners who want wind coverage have to buy separate policies through the North Carolina Joint Underwriting Association or private windstorm carriers. Some houses are becoming effectively uninsurable. Government-subsidized flood policies won't pay out until a house is actually destroyed. They won't cover the cost of proactive demolition or debris cleanup. So the houses sit on their pilings as the beach erodes beneath them, and the owners wait, and the insurance covers less and less. And when the house finally goes, the debris becomes the federal government's problem, scattered across miles of national seashore. The Outer Banks still draws millions. The Wright Brothers Memorial sees 400,000 visitors a year. Cape Hatteras National Seashore draws 2.8 million, generating $650 million in nearby community spending and supporting 7,000 jobs. The Lost Colony keeps staging its play on Roanoke Island, 89 seasons and counting, the audience sitting under the stars on the Sound, while more than 100 actors reenact the disappearance of 117 people who tried to build something permanent on these islands and failed. The wild horses still run on the beaches north of Corolla, descendants, some believe, of Spanish mustangs that swam ashore from 16th century shipwrecks, though the genetics are debated. Modern research has linked some herds to Spanish stud horses from the Caribbean, brought to the region by Grenville's expedition in the 1580s. The fishing is still world-class. The sunsets over the Pamlico Sound are still the kind that make people pull over and stand on the shoulder of the road. The graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras Village displays an actual Enigma machine recovered from a German U-boat sunk off the coast in 1942. A reminder that the same water lapping against the vacation houses once burned with the fires of torpedoed tankers. But the math is getting harder to ignore. In 2024, visitor spending in Dare County dipped 2.3% from the previous year. The Outer Banks Visitors Bureau projected 2025 spending down another 5%, citing tariff uncertainty and economic headwinds. The cost of nourishment is rising faster than the tax revenue that pays for it. The county manager told state legislators that the funding model cannot sustain itself. The state DOT engineer asked if there was another highway in North Carolina as vulnerable as Highway 12, shuffled his feet and said, "No," emphatically. David Stick, who wrote the book on the graveyard of the Atlantic and then turned around and developed some of its shoreline, died in 2009. He had lived on the Outer Banks for decades. He had watched it transform from the remote, wind-scoured place where the Wright brothers came looking for emptiness into a $2 billion resort economy where you can rent a 24-bedroom house with an elevator and a pool. Whether he saw the irony or simply accepted it as the way of barrier islands, places that exist in constant negotiation between land and sea, always gaining here, always losing there, is unclear. He was a historian. He knew that the Outer Banks had been migrating westward for 10,000 years. He knew that the sand would keep moving no matter what anyone built on it. In 1870, they put a lighthouse 1,500 feet from the ocean. By 1999, they had to drag it backward to keep the ocean from swallowing it. Today, the county is spending $50 million to put 2 million cubic yards of sand on the beach at Buxton, the village where the lighthouse stands, the village where 5 houses fell in 45 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The sand will hold for a while. The storms will come. The dredging ships will return. The subscription will renew. On Tower Circle Road in Buxton, where 2 of those houses collapsed, the beach is closed, hazardous debris, structures at risk of further collapse. The pilings that held the houses are still there, some of them, angled into the surf like broken teeth. When the tide goes out, you can see the foundations of what used to be someone's investment property, someone's rental income, someone's idea of building something on the Outer Banks. The ocean doesn't care what it cost. The ocean has been taking things from these islands since before the English arrived, since before the Spanish brigantine went down in 1526, since before the barrier islands existed in their current form. The sand moves. It always has. The only question is what we insist on putting in its way.